There are moments in life when the universe sends us messengers, people who appear at crossroads bearing wisdom we're too proud or too foolish to accept. Sometimes these messengers come in forms we don't expect, speaking truths we don't want to hear. And sometimes, by the time we realize they were right, it's already too late to undo the choices we've made. This is a story about one such messenger, one such choice, and the winter that changed everything for a man who thought he knew better than the land itself. The dust rose in lazy spirals behind Thomas Brennan's boots as he walked the fence line of his ranch, squinting against the September sun that still beat down with summer's fury. The Arizona territory stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of red earth, scattered mesquite, and the distant purple shadows of mountains that seemed to float above the horizon like a mirage. He pulled his hat lower over his weathered face and wiped the sweat from his brow with a bandana that had long ago lost its color to the relentless sun and alkaline water. Thomas had come to this land 5 years earlier with nothing but a dream, a small inheritance from his father's failed general store in Pennsylvania, and a stubborn determination that bordered on recklessness. His wife Margaret had begged him not to go, pleading that they had a good life in Pittsburgh, that he had a steady job at the railroad yard, that starting over in the frontier was madness for a man approaching 40. But Thomas had read the pamphlets, heard the stories, seen the advertisements promising land and opportunity in the territories. He'd made up his mind, and when Thomas Brennan made up his mind, not even God himself could change it. Margaret had died of fever 2 years after they arrived, leaving Thomas with their 8-year-old son Samuel, and a ranch that was only just beginning to turn a profit. The boy had his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, a combination that both comforted and worried Thomas in equal measure. Samuel was all he had left in this world, and the ranch was all he had to give the boy. Every fence post he drove into the rocky soil, every calf that survived to market weight, every gallon of water he coaxed from the stubborn well, it was all for Samuel's future. The ranch wasn't much by the standards of the big cattle operations that were beginning to dominate the territory. Thomas ran about 200 head of cattle on land that was more rock than grass, supplementing his income by breaking horses for the army fort 30 miles to the east. But it was his, bought and paid for with sweat and blood, and Margaret's dreams that she'd buried alongside her in the small cemetery behind the house. The cattle were scattered across the southern pasture, their red and white forms dotting the landscape like paint splatters on canvas. Thomas counted them automatically, a habit so ingrained he did it without thinking. 187. 13 were in the northern pasture near the creek, where the grass grew slightly greener. It wasn't ideal grazing land, but it was what he had, and he'd learned to make it work. He was examining a section of fence that had worked loose when he heard the sound, a soft footfall on the hard-packed earth that was barely audible over the constant whisper of the wind. Thomas's hand instinctively moved toward the Winchester rifle he always carried when working the far sections of the property. The Apache raids had supposedly ended years ago, but old habits died hard in this country, and a man who let his guard down often didn't get a second chance. But when he turned, he found not a warrior but a woman standing about 20 feet away. As still as the rock formations that dotted the landscape. She was Apache. That much was immediately clear from her dress and bearing. Her skin was deeply bronzed by the sun, her face lined with years he couldn't begin to count. She might have been 40 or 70. It was impossible to say. She wore a simple dress of faded calico, but around her shoulders was a traditional Apache camp dress, intricately decorated with symbols and patterns that seemed to shift in the bright sunlight. Her hair, shot through with silver, was bound back in the traditional way, and her eyes, dark and knowing, regarded him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Thomas's grip tightened on the rifle, though he didn't raise it. In 5 years on this land, he'd had few encounters with the Apache. Most had been moved to the reservations, though everyone knew that some still moved through these mountains, preferring their traditional ways to the government's promises of rations and civilization. Thomas had always maintained a careful neutrality. He didn't bother them, and they didn't bother him. It had worked well enough so far. "Can I help you?" Thomas asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Are you lost?" The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, her eyes moving past him to take in the fence, the scattered cattle, the distant shape of his ranch house with its thin stream of smoke rising from the chimney, where Samuel was supposed to be doing his lessons. When her gaze finally returned to Thomas, she spoke in English that was heavily accented but perfectly clear. "The cold is coming," she said simply. Thomas frowned, glancing up at the cloudless sky and the sun that was still baking the earth. "It's only September," he replied. "We've got 2 months before any real cold sets in." The woman shook her head slowly, a gesture that somehow conveyed both patience and frustration. "Not the cold of winter's beginning, the cold that kills. It comes early this year. It comes with teeth." Despite himself, Thomas felt a small chill run down his spine. Ridiculous given the heat that was making his shirt stick to his back. There was something in the woman's voice, in the certainty of her words, that carried weight. But he was a practical man. A man who believed in thermometers and almanacs and his own observations, not in mystical predictions from strangers. "I appreciate the warning," he said carefully, not wanting to offend but not wanting to encourage this conversation either. "But I've learned to read the signs of this land pretty well. The cattle are still in their summer coats, the birds haven't started moving south yet, and the sky's been clear as glass for weeks. I don't think we're in for an early winter." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment Thomas had the unsettling feeling that she could see right through him, past his words and his confidence to something deeper and more uncertain. She took a step forward, and though he was a head taller and probably 60 pounds heavier, Thomas had to fight the urge to step back. "The signs you know are not the only signs," she said. "The earth speaks in ways your eyes cannot see. 3 days ago, the ravens flew west at sunrise. They never fly west at sunrise. The coyotes are digging their dens deep, deeper than I have seen in 20 winters. The pinyon trees have made more cones this year than in the last 5 years together. Even the ants know what is coming." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He didn't like being lectured, especially by someone who had walked onto his property uninvited. "That's all well and good," he said, trying to keep his voice level. "But I've got work to do, and I can't afford to panic over what might happen. I've got to deal with what is happening." "You have cattle," the woman said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, I do. 200 head, give or take. They will die if you leave them in the open." Thomas let out a short, humorless laugh. "Ma'am, I don't know what you expect me to do. I can't exactly bring 200 cattle into my house. They're range cattle. They're built for this climate. They are built for the winters they know. Not for the winter that comes." The woman's voice was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it that Thomas couldn't quite dismiss. "I have seen this cold before, when I was a girl. It came without warning, and it killed everything. The cattle, the horses, even the elk in the mountains. My people call it the White Death winter. The cold that comes from the north like a wolf fast and hungry." Thomas shook his head. "With all respect, I've heard stories like this before. Every old-timer in the territory has a tale about the winter to end all winters. But I've been through 4 winters here, and the worst we got was a week of hard freeze and a little snow. My cattle came through just fine." "This is not a story," the woman said, and for the first time, there was a sharp edge to her voice. "This is memory. This is warning. You have a son." The mention of Samuel made Thomas's protective instincts flare. "My son is none of your concern. He is your future. The cattle are your wealth. The cold that comes will take both if you do not prepare." She reached into a small pouch that hung at her side and pulled out something that glinted in the sunlight. When she held out her hand, Thomas saw it was a small piece of turquoise, carved with intricate symbols. "My grandmother gave this to my mother. My mother gave it to me. It has protected my family through many winters. I give it to you now because the signs say you will need it." Thomas stared at the offered stone, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with this entire encounter. "I can't take that," he said. "It's obviously important to you." "It is important to you now," the woman replied. "The earth has sent me to you. I do not question why. I only do what must be done." "Look," Thomas said, his patience finally wearing thin. "I appreciate that you're trying to help, but I don't believe in magic stones or prophecies or any of that. I believe in hard work and preparation based on facts. When the weather starts to turn, I'll bring some of the cattle closer to the ranch. I've got a shelter I can use if we get a bad storm. I'll be fine." The woman slowly closed her hand around the turquoise, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she simply looked at him, and Thomas had the uncomfortable feeling that he was being weighed and measured and found somehow lacking. "You believe you are strong," she finally said. "Do you believe your will can overcome the land? This is the thinking of a fool, but it is not my place to force wisdom on one who does not want it." She turned as if to leave, then paused and looked back at him. "When the cold comes, and it will come, Remember that you were warned. Remember that pride is a poor blanket against the wind." With that, she walked away, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who might have been 70 years old. Thomas watched her go, feeling an odd mixture of relief and unease. She headed toward the rocky foothills to the north, and within minutes she had vanished among the boulders and scrub, as completely as if she'd never been there at all. Thomas stood there for several minutes after she'd gone, the encounter playing through his mind. Then, with a shake of his head, he turned back to the fence he'd been repairing. He was a practical man. He couldn't afford to let superstitious warnings distract him from the work that needed to be done. But as he worked, he found his eyes drifting to the northern horizon more than once, and the sky that had seemed so benign suddenly felt somehow ominous, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something he couldn't see. That evening, as Thomas and Samuel sat down to their simple dinner of beans and cornbread, the boy looked up from his plate with curious eyes. "Pa," he said, "I saw you talking to someone out by the south fence today. Who was it?" Thomas paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "You saw that? I was up in the loft of the barn putting away some hay. I couldn't hear what you were saying, but I saw you talking to an Indian woman." Thomas set down his spoon, considering his words carefully. Samuel was at that age where he absorbed everything, and Thomas wanted to teach the boy to be respectful but also skeptical, to listen to wisdom but not to be swayed by superstition. "It was an Apache woman," he said finally. "She came to warn me about the weather." "What did she say?" "She said a bad winter is coming. Said it would be early and hard." "Do you believe her?" Samuel asked, his young face serious. Thomas looked at his son and saw Margaret's eyes staring back at him, trusting and questioning at the same time. "I believe she believes it," he said carefully. "But believing something doesn't make it true. The weather follows patterns, Samuel. You can predict it by watching the signs. Real signs, like the temperature and the wind and what the almanac says, not by listening to stories." Samuel nodded slowly, but Thomas could see the doubt in his eyes. The boy had been born in this territory, had grown up hearing the old stories from the Mexican hands who sometimes worked the ranch, the tales the freighters told when they stopped for water. He was more receptive to such things than Thomas was comfortable with. "But Pa," Samuel said quietly, "what if she's right?" Thomas reached across the table and tasseled his son's hair, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Then we'll deal with it when it comes. We've got supplies, we've got shelter, and we've got each other. That's all we need." But that night, as Thomas lay in his bed listening to the wind that had picked up after sunset, he found himself thinking about the Apache woman's words. He thought about the certainty in her voice, the strange weight of her warning. And despite himself, despite his practical nature and his faith in observable facts, he felt a small seed of doubt taking root in his mind. The September days continued to pass in their usual rhythm. Thomas worked the ranch, Samuel did his lessons and his chores, and the sun beat down with relentless consistency. But Thomas found himself watching the sky more than usual, noting the movements of the birds and the behavior of the cattle, with an attention he told himself was just good ranching practice, nothing to do with an old woman's warning. A week after the encounter, Thomas rode into town to pick up supplies and to deliver 3 horses he'd broken for the fort. The town of Redemption was barely worthy of the name. 24 buildings clustered around a dusty main street, including a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the combination telegraph office and post office that connected them to the wider world. As Thomas loaded flour and sugar into his wagon, the storekeeper, a garrulous man named Henderson, leaned against the counter and wiped his hands on his apron. "Heard you had a visitor last week?" he said casually. Thomas looked up sharply. "News travels fast." Henderson shrugged. "Joe Mendez was passing through your area, saw you talking to an Indian woman. Said she looked like one of the old ones, the ones who remember the free days." "She came to warn me about the weather," Thomas said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Said a bad winter's coming." To his surprise, Henderson's jovial expression faded. "She say that, did she? Well, might be something to that." "You believe in that kind of thing?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "I believe in not ignoring what the old ones say," Henderson replied. "They've been in this land a lot longer than we have. They know things we don't." He paused and added, "My wife's Mexican, you know. Her grandmother was full-blood Yaqui. She's been saying the same thing, that this winter's going to be bad. Says the animals know." Thomas paid for his supplies, troubled by Henderson's words. It was one thing for an Apache woman to make predictions based on traditional knowledge. It was another for a practical businessman like Henderson to take them seriously. As he drove the wagon back to his ranch, the seed of doubt that had been planted grew a little larger. But Thomas Brennan was not a man who changed his course easily. He had learned long ago that success came from sticking to your plans, from not being swayed by every warning or worry that came along. He would prepare for winter as he always did, sensibly, methodically, based on the calendar and his experience. He would not panic. He would not be ruled by superstition. He was master of his own fate and the fate of his ranch. The Apache woman's warning faded in his memory as the days passed, becoming just another strange encounter in a land full of strange encounters. Thomas returned to his routine, confident in his decisions, certain in his judgment, but the land, as it always did, kept its own counsel, and in the north, beyond the mountains, he could see from his porch something was stirring that cared nothing for his confidence or his certainty. The cold was coming, just as she had said, and it was hungry. October came to the Arizona Territory with a suddenness that caught everyone by surprise. One day the sun was beating down with its usual ferocity, and the next a cool wind was blowing down from the mountains, carrying with it the smell of pine and something else. Something sharp and metallic that Thomas couldn't quite identify. Thomas stood on his porch that first morning of October, his coffee steaming in the cool air, and watched the sky. It was different somehow, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly how. The blue seemed deeper, almost aggressive in its intensity, and the clouds that were beginning to form on the northern horizon had a strange, heavy quality to them. "Pah, it's cold," Samuel said, stepping out onto the porch wrapped in the blanket from his bed. Real cold. It was cold, colder than it should have been for early October. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 42 degrees, and Thomas knew it would only get colder before the sun came up properly. He found himself thinking about the Apache woman's words, then pushed the thought away irritably. "Go get dressed in something warm," he told Samuel. "We've got work to do." The cattle had started moving closer to the ranch of their own accord, clustering in the draws and arroyos where there was some shelter from the wind. Thomas noticed it but told himself it was normal behavior as the seasons changed. Cattle always moved around according to the weather and the available forage. There was nothing unusual about it. But over the next few days, as October settled in with unseasonable cold, Thomas began to see other signs that troubled him. The birds were indeed moving south, but not in their usual leisurely progression. They flew in dense flocks, urgent and purposeful, filling the sky at dawn and dusk with their calls. The coyotes that usually yipped and howled from the hills were silent, and once, riding the northern fence line, Thomas had seen a mountain lion moving down from the high country, unusual for this time of year. The temperature continued to drop. By mid-October, they were seeing frost most mornings, and the water in the troughs had a thin skin of ice that had to be broken. The grass, which should have still been green in the irrigated pastures, was turning brown and brittle earlier than Thomas had ever seen. He told himself it was just an early cold snap, that warm weather would return as it always did in October. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, he knew something was wrong. It was on October 18 when Juan Rodriguez, one of the Mexican hands who worked occasional jobs for Thomas, rode up to the ranch house on a lathered horse, his face grim. Juan was a steady man, not given to dramatics. So when Thomas saw his expression, his stomach tightened with concern. "Senor Thomas," Juan said, swinging down from his horse, "I come from the Gonzalez Ranch, 20 miles north. They have word from the telegraph. There is a storm coming from Canada." "A big storm. They say it is the worst in 50 years. Thomas felt his mouth go dry. "When?" "They say maybe 3 days, maybe 4. But, Senor Thomas, it is not just the storm. The temperature, it is falling everywhere. In Denver, they had snow already, 2 feet. In Wyoming, the cattle are dying. The railroad is stopped because the snow is too deep." "In October?" Thomas couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "That's impossible." Juan shook his head. "That's impossible." "It is happening. My wife's family, they have been preparing for 2 weeks. Her grandmother, she is Apache, and she said this would come. She saw it in the signs." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "How long do we have? 3 days, maybe 4. But, Senor, you should see the sky in the north. It is like nothing I have ever seen." Thomas looked toward the northern horizon and saw what Juan meant. The clouds were building there, dark and heavy, with an odd greenish tinge to them that made the hair on his arms stand up. It looked less like normal storm clouds and more like a solid wall, an advancing army of grey and black that seemed to devour the sky as it came. "What are you going to do?" Thomas asked. "We are taking the cattle to the canyon near the Gonzales Ranch. There is shelter there, walls of rock, trees for windbreak. It will be crowded, but maybe they survive. You should do the same, senor. You should move your cattle now." Thomas thought about his 200 head scattered across the ranch, thought about the time and work it would take to gather them and drive them anywhere. His nearest neighbors were miles away, and he had no canyon, no natural shelter except for the small barn and the lean-to he'd built for the horses. "I've got a shelter," he said, more to convince himself than one. "I can bring some of the cattle in close to the ranch. The barn, the lean-to, maybe crowd some into the corral. I can put out extra hay, break ice in the water troughs. I've got supplies laid in." Juan looked at him with something like pity in his eyes. "Senor, the shelter you have, it is not enough, not for what is coming. I have heard the stories of the White Death winter from my wife's family. The cattle, they freeze where they stand. The cold, it is like knives. Nothing survives in the open." "I'll manage," Thomas said, his jaw tight. "I've been through hard winters before." "Not this winter," Juan said quietly. "But I can see you have made your decision. I will tell the others you choose to stay. If you need help, if you change your mind, you send Samuel to the Gonzales Ranch." "We will come." After Juan left, Thomas stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the advancing wall of clouds. He thought about the Apache woman, about her warning, about the turquoise stone she'd tried to give him. He thought about Henderson's words in the general store, about Juan's urgency, about the stories of the White Death winter. But he also thought about the cost of being wrong in the other direction. If he drove his cattle 20 miles to someone else's canyon, crowding in with other ranchers' herds, and the storm turned out to be nothing, he'd lose animals to stress and injury. He'd lose time he couldn't afford to lose. He'd look like a fool, panicking over every rumor and prediction. And more than that, more than he wanted to admit even to himself, there was his pride. Thomas Brennan had built this ranch from nothing. He'd survived drought and disease, and the skepticism of every established rancher in the territory who'd told him he'd fail. He'd proven them all wrong through sheer determination and refusal to quit. The idea of running away, of admitting he couldn't handle whatever was coming, stuck in his throat like a bone. "Pa." Samuel's voice came from behind him. "Are we going to move the cattle?" Thomas turned to find his son standing in the doorway, his young face worried but trusting. Whatever his father decided, Samuel would accept. That trust was both a comfort and a burden. "No," Thomas said, making his decision. "We're going to weather this here. We'll bring the cattle in close, put out extra feed, make sure they've got water. We've survived everything else this land has thrown at us. We'll survive this too." Samuel nodded, accepting his father's judgment, as he always did. But Thomas saw the doubt in his eyes, the same doubt he was trying to ignore in his own heart. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity. Thomas and Samuel worked from first light to full dark, gathering the cattle and bringing them in close to the ranch. It was exhausting work. Range cattle didn't like being bunched up, and they kept trying to scatter back to their usual grazing areas. But gradually, Thomas got them consolidated in the 2 pastures closest to the ranch house, where he could watch them and where they had some protection from a stand of cottonwoods and the ranch buildings themselves. He put out hay, more than he'd ever put out before, creating piles that the cattle could access even if the ground was covered with snow. He broke through the ice in the creek and the water troughs, making sure the cattle could drink. He checked and rechecked his supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, lamp oil, firewood. He had enough for 2 or 3 months if they were careful. The temperature continued to drop. By the second day, it wasn't rising above freezing even at midday. The wind picked up, coming out of the north in cold gusts that seemed to cut through clothing and flesh right to the bone. The sky remained clear, but that wall of clouds on the horizon kept building, kept advancing, like a slow-moving tide. On the 3rd day, the wind died completely. The sudden stillness was eerie, unnatural. The cattle stood huddled together, their breath visible in the cold air, their eyes wide and nervous. Even the horses in the barn were restless, stamping and snorting, sensing something Thomas couldn't see. That afternoon, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, Thomas saw someone walking up the road to his ranch. Even from a distance, he recognized the steady, purposeful gait. It was the Apache woman. She walked right up to the porch where Thomas was standing, her face as unreadable as before. But in her eyes, Thomas saw something he hadn't seen in their first encounter. A deep sadness, the kind of sorrow that comes from knowing something terrible is going to happen, and being powerless to stop it. "You did not listen," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "I'm prepared," Thomas said. But even to his own ears it sounded defensive. The woman looked past him at the cattle bunched in the near pastures, at the hay piled in careful mounds, at the ranch house with its thin trail of smoke. Then she looked back at him, and Thomas felt that same uncomfortable feeling of being seen through, of being understood in ways he didn't want to be understood. "You are brave," she said, "but you confuse bravery with wisdom. The cold that comes tonight, it does not care about your courage or your preparation. It cares nothing for your pride or your will. It is simply cold, and it will take what it wants." "I've got shelter," Thomas said. "I've got supplies. My cattle are close where I can watch them. Whatever comes, I'll handle it." The woman reached into her pouch again and pulled out the same piece of turquoise she'd offered before. This time, though, she pressed it into his hand before he could refuse. Her fingers were warm despite the cold, and the stone felt oddly heavy, as if it weighed more than any piece of rock should. "This is not for the cattle," she said. "This is for your son. When the cold becomes too much, when you face the choice, remember what matters most. The cattle will die. They are already dead, though they still breathe. But your son can live, if you choose wisely." Thomas felt anger flare up in him, hot and defensive. "My son is fine. We're both fine. We're going to be fine." "You believe this because you must believe it," the woman said. "But belief does not change what is." "The cold comes with the sunset. By morning, you will understand. By morning, you will face the choice I see in your eyes even now. The choice you are pretending does not exist." "What choice?" Thomas demanded, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes holding depths of knowledge and sadness. "You will know," she said finally. "When the moment comes, you will know. I only pray you choose the right path, though I fear you will not." She turned to leave, then paused. "There is a cave in the rocks, 2 miles north of here, in the Red Cliffs. You can reach it in an hour, even in the storm. It has been used by my people for generations in times of great cold. If you go there, if you take your son there, you will survive." "I'm not abandoning my ranch," Thomas said flatly. The woman nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. "Then may the spirits protect you," she said, "and may you forgive yourself for what you must do." She walked away then, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Thomas watched her go, the turquoise stone heavy in his hand. He wanted to throw it away, to reject this whole situation and everything it represented. But instead, he found himself putting it in his pocket, telling himself it meant nothing, that he was just being polite. As the sun touched the horizon, the temperature plummeted. Thomas felt it happen, felt the air change from merely cold to something altogether different. This wasn't the cold of a winter morning, or even the sharp cold of a mountain night. This was something primal and aggressive, a cold that seemed to have intent, that seemed to reach for you with invisible claws. By the time Thomas and Samuel finished the evening chores, the thermometer read 12 degrees and was still falling. The sky was clear, filled with stars that seemed to throb with cold light. But on the northern horizon, that wall of clouds was closer now, so close that Thomas could see lightning flickering inside it, not the yellow-white of summer lightning, but a strange blue-white that looked cold even from a distance. Samuel was shivering despite his coat and the wool cap Thomas had made him wear. "Pa, it's really cold." "I know, son. Come on, let's get inside." They made dinner, beans and cornbread again, with some of the salt pork fried up, and sat close to the stove, feeding it wood until it glowed red. Outside the wind picked up again, but this time it wasn't the variable gusts of the past few days. This was a steady, screaming wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once, finding every crack and crevice in the ranch house walls and forcing its way inside. Thomas got up and stuffed rags into the gaps around the windows and doors, but it didn't seem to help much. The cold was seeping in regardless, making the house feel more like a barn than a shelter. He could see his breath inside, even with the stove going full blast. Around midnight, the snow started. Thomas heard it first as a hissing sound against the windows, like sand being thrown at the glass. But when he looked outside, he couldn't see anything but white. Not falling snow, but horizontal snow, driven by a wind that must have been blowing 50 miles an hour or more. The temperature was still dropping. Thomas kept checking the thermometer, even though he knew he shouldn't. Couldn't help himself. By 1 in the morning, it read 5 below zero. By 2, it was 10 below. The wind was so loud now that Thomas could barely hear himself think. Samuel was huddled under every blanket they owned, and Thomas had put the boy's mattress right next to the stove. He himself sat in a chair nearby, feeding the fire, trying not to think about how much wood they were going through, trying not to think about the cattle outside in this hell. Around 3 in the morning, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The bellowing of terrified cattle. He went to the window and tried to see out, but the snow was too thick, the darkness too complete. The sound came again, closer this time, and Thomas realized the cattle were moving, panicking, trying to find shelter that didn't exist. He knew he should go out, try to calm them, try to keep them from scattering. But when he opened the door even a crack, the wind tore it from his hands and slammed it back against the wall. The cold that rushed in was like nothing he'd ever experienced. It stole his breath, made his eyes water instantly, seemed to freeze his lungs. He managed to get the door closed again, but it took all his strength. "Pa?" Samuel's voice was small and scared in the darkness. "It's okay, son. The cattle are just spooked by the storm. They'll settle down." But Thomas knew they wouldn't settle down. He knew, with a sick certainty, that the Apache woman had been right. This cold was beyond anything he'd prepared for, beyond anything his cattle could survive. By morning, most of them would be dead. The only question now was whether he and Samuel would survive. The night stretched on endlessly. Thomas fed the stove, wrapped more blankets around Samuel, tried to keep the cold at bay through sheer force of will. But the cold kept coming, relentless and inexorable, making a mockery of his preparations and his pride. Around 4 in the morning, the stove started to die. Thomas had been feeding it constantly, but he realized with growing horror that something was wrong. The chimney must have been blocked by snow or ice, because the smoke wasn't drawing properly. He had a choice: keep feeding the fire and risk filling the house with smoke and carbon monoxide, or let the fire die and face the cold directly. He chose to let it die. Better to freeze than to suffocate. Without the stove, the temperature inside the house plummeted. Within an hour, frost was forming on the inside of the windows. Thomas's fingers were going numb despite his gloves. Samuel was shivering violently, his lips turning blue. That's when Thomas remembered the cave the Apache woman had mentioned. 2 miles north, she'd said, in the Red Cliffs, a place his people had used for generations. 2 miles. In this storm, in this cold, it might as well have been 200. But staying here meant freezing to death by morning. The ranch house, which had seemed so solid and safe, was nothing but a wood box with a broken stove. It offered no more protection than being out in the open. Thomas looked at his son, shivering under the pile of blankets, and felt the weight of the impossible choice settling on his shoulders. The Apache woman had known. She'd seen this moment coming, had tried to warn him, had offered him the means to avoid it. And in his pride and stubbornness, he'd ignored her. Now he had to decide: stay here and freeze, or risk everything on a desperate attempt to reach a cave he'd never seen, in a storm that was trying to kill them, leaving behind everything he'd worked for, every dream he'd built on this land. The cattle were already dead or dying. He knew that now, even though he couldn't see them. The ranch itself would survive, or it wouldn't, but it was just wood and fence posts and earth. Samuel was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that was truly his. Thomas stood up, his decision made. "Samuel," he said, his voice rough, "get dressed. Everything warm you have. We're leaving." The boy looked at him with wide eyes. "Leaving? Where?" "To a cave the Apache woman told me about. It's not far." "What about the cattle? What about the ranch?" Thomas felt something break inside him, some stubborn pride that had sustained him through 5 years of struggle and loss. "The cattle are gone," he said quietly. "The ranch will still be here when we come back. But if we stay here, we'll die. Do you understand, son? We have to go now." Samuel nodded, his trust in his father absolute even now. As the boy dressed in every layer of clothing he owned, Thomas gathered what supplies he could carry: some food, matches, a blanket. He looked around the house at everything he and Margaret had built here, and felt a grief so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. Then he picked up the turquoise stone from where he'd set it on the mantel, and he understood what the Apache woman had meant. This wasn't magic or medicine or mystical protection. It was simply a reminder of what mattered, a physical token of the choice between pride and survival, between things and people, between what you want to keep and what you must have the wisdom to let go. As Thomas and Samuel stepped out into the killing cold, beginning their desperate journey toward the cave, and whatever fate awaited them there, Thomas finally understood the true meaning of the Apache woman's warning. She hadn't come to save his cattle or his ranch. She'd come to save his soul, to offer him the chance to choose rightly when the impossible choice arrived. Whether he'd made that choice in time remained to be seen. The moment Thomas and Samuel stepped off the porch, the full fury of the storm hit them like a physical blow. The wind drove snow into their faces with such force that it felt like being sandblasted. Thomas could barely see 3 feet in front of him, and the cold was so intense that each breath seared his lungs. He held Samuel's hand in an iron grip, knowing that if they were separated in this whiteout, they would never find each other again. The boy was bundled in every piece of clothing he owned, a scarf wrapped around his face until only his eyes were visible. But Thomas could feel him shivering through all those layers. "Stay close to me," Thomas shouted, though his words were immediately torn away by the wind. "Don't let go of my hand." They pushed forward into the darkness and the storm. Thomas had a general sense of north from the ranch's layout, and he knew the red cliffs were in that direction, but finding a specific cave in these conditions seemed impossible. Every few steps he had to stop and shield his face from the wind just to catch his breath. Snow was already accumulating on their clothes, forming a thick white crust that made movement even more difficult. Time lost all meaning in the storm. Thomas had no idea if they'd been walking for 5 minutes or an hour. His feet were numb despite his boots, and his fingers were losing sensation even inside his gloves. Beside him, Samuel stumbled frequently, and Thomas had to half carry, half drag the boy forward. Just when Thomas was beginning to think he'd made a fatal mistake, that they should have stayed in the house after all, he saw something through the swirling snow, a darker patch against the white, a suggestion of solid rock. He angled toward it, hope and desperation giving him strength he didn't know he had left. The cliffs materialized out of the storm like a wall of salvation. Thomas felt his way along the rock face, searching for an opening, any kind of shelter. His hands were so numb that he could barely feel the stone, but he kept searching, refusing to give up now that they were so close. Then his hand found empty space, a dark opening in the cliff face. The cave. Thomas practically fell inside, pulling Samuel with him. The relief from the wind was immediate and overwhelming. They were still cold, terribly cold, but at least they weren't being battered by that relentless gale. Thomas fumbled in his pack for the matches he'd brought, his fingers clumsy and unresponsive. It took him 4 tries to strike a match, and when it finally flared to life, the small flame seemed like a miracle. In its brief light, Thomas saw they were in a cave that went back about 15 feet into the cliff. The walls were smooth, carved by wind and water over countless years, and the floor was covered with a thick layer of sand and dust that suggested many feet had walked here before. But what really caught his attention was what lay against the far wall, a pile of wood, neatly stacked and clearly placed there deliberately. Next to it was a stack of what looked like bundled sage and dried grass for kindling. Someone had prepared this place, had left supplies for travelers in need. The Apache woman. She must have come here yesterday or the day before, knowing he would need it, preparing for his arrival even though he'd rejected her warning. The realization of her kindness, her foresight, and his own stubborn foolishness hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He got a fire going with trembling hands, beating it carefully until it blazed strong and hot. The cave filled with warmth and light, and gradually, feelings started to return to his extremities. First as painful tingling, then as sharp, stabbing sensation that made him gasp. Samuel huddled close to the fire, his teeth chattering so violently he couldn't speak. Thomas wrapped the blanket around them both and held his son close, sharing what warmth they had between them. Outside, the storm continued its assault, the wind howling like something alive and angry, but inside the cave, they were safe. As the night wore on and the fire burned steadily, Thomas found himself thinking about everything that had led to this moment. He thought about his pride, about his refusal to listen, about how close he'd come to killing both himself and his son through sheer stubbornness. He thought about Margaret, about what she would have said if she'd been here. She would have listened to the Apache woman. She would have recognized the wisdom in the warning, would have set aside pride in favor of survival. He thought about the cattle still out there in the killing cold. Some might have found shelter in the draws and arroyos, might survive huddled together, but most would be dead by morning, frozen where they stood, their value and his investment lost to a winter he'd refused to believe could come. 5 years of work wiped out in a single night. The ranch would still be there when, if, they made it back. But what good was land without stock? How would he rebuild? How would he face the other ranchers who'd heard his warning and moved their cattle to safety, while he'd stayed behind out of pride? But then he looked at Samuel, sleeping fitfully against his side, and he understood what the Apache woman had been trying to tell him. The cattle could be replaced. The ranch could be rebuilt. But his son was irreplaceable. In choosing to come here, in finally listening to the wisdom that had been offered to him, Thomas had saved the only thing that truly mattered. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 5 years building the ranch for Samuel's future, sacrificing time and health and happiness to create something of value to leave his son. And in one night, he'd lost it all. But in losing it, he'd saved Samuel himself. In the end, the ranch had always been just a means to an end, and he'd been in danger of forgetting what that end was. Thomas must have dozed off at some point because he woke with a start to find grey light filtering into the cave entrance. The storm had passed. He could hear the wind still blowing outside, but it was nothing like the fury of the night before. He carefully disentangled himself from Samuel and went to the cave entrance. What he saw made him catch his breath. The world had been transformed into an alien landscape of white. Snow had drifted against every obstruction, creating sculptures that were both beautiful and terrifying. The depth was impossible to judge. In some places it looked like only a few inches, while in others drifts rose 10 or 12 feet high. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the color of ice, and the cold was still intense, though nothing like the murderous fury of the night before. Thomas couldn't see his ranch from here, but he knew with a sick certainty what he would find when he returned. The cattle would be scattered and dead, the buildings probably damaged by the wind and snow. Everything he'd worked for, gone. "Pa?" Samuel's voice came from behind him, thick with sleep. "Is the storm over?" "The worst of it," Thomas said, turning back to his son. "How are you feeling?" "Cold, tired, but okay." Samuel came to stand beside his father, looking out at the transformed landscape. "Did we make it, Pa?" Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "Yeah, son, we made it." They stayed in the cave for another day, waiting for the temperature to moderate and the drifts to settle. They had food enough for a few more meals, and there was plenty of wood. Thomas ventured out once to gather snow to melt for water, and what he saw confirmed his fears. The thermometer, if it had survived, would probably read 20 or 30 below zero. Nothing could survive long in this. On the second day, with the temperature finally rising towards zero and the wind dying down, they made their way back to the ranch. The journey that had taken them perhaps an hour in the storm took 3 hours in daylight, fighting through drifts and around obstacles. Several times they had to detour around snow that was simply too deep to cross. When they finally crested the rise that looked down on Thomas's ranch, he had to stop and steady himself. The house was still standing, though one corner of the roof had collapsed under the weight of snow. The barn appeared intact, though the door was hanging open, banging in the breeze. The corral fences were down in several places, and the cattle. Thomas could see dark shapes dotting the white landscape, motionless humps that would never move again. He counted the ones he could see, and stopped counting at 50. The rest would be scattered across the range, buried under snow, or frozen in the draws where they'd sought shelter. Samuel was quiet beside him, taking in the destruction. Finally, he asked, "Pa, what are we going to do?" It was the same question Thomas had been asking himself. They descended to the ranch, and the closer they got, the worse the damage appeared. The lean-to had collapsed completely. Hay that he'd so carefully put out was buried under snow. The water troughs were solid blocks of ice, but the house was still there, and when Thomas got the door open and checked inside, he found it was salvageable. Cold as a tomb and with water damage from the collapsed roof section, but the stove was intact, and most of their supplies had survived. They spent that afternoon making the house habitable again, getting the stove going, clearing snow, and starting repairs. As Thomas worked, his hands busy even as his mind churned with worry and planning, he heard horses approaching. It was Juan Rodriguez, along with 3 other riders Thomas recognized from neighboring ranches. They looked tired and worried, but when they saw Thomas and Samuel, relief flooded their faces. Dios mío, Juan breathed. You are alive. We thought, when we saw what the storm did, we thought no one in the open could have survived. We didn't stay in the open, Thomas said. We went to a cave, the one the Apache woman told me about. Juan's eyes widened. She came to you again? Before the storm? She did. And this time, I listened. Too late to save the cattle, but in time to save what mattered. Thomas looked at Samuel, who was talking with one of the other men, animated despite his exhaustion. She knew. She tried to warn me earlier, but I wouldn't listen. She warned many people, Juan said quietly. Some listened. You are lucky you listened when you did. Over the next hour, as they rested and shared coffee that Thomas managed to make on the repaired stove, the men told Thomas what they'd learned from their own experiences and from other ranches. The storm had been worse than anything in living memory. The White Death winter the Apache had warned about. Cattle had died by the thousands across the territory. Some ranchers had lost everything. Others, those who'd heed the warnings and moved their stock to shelter, had lost 30 or 40% but could survive. Thomas had lost nearly everything. Of his 200 head, only 23 were found alive in a deep arroyo where they'd huddled together, protected by the rock walls and their own body heat. It wasn't enough to sustain the ranch, not by itself. He would have to find other work, rebuild slowly, maybe over years. But he was alive, and Samuel was alive, and the land was still his. It was more than many had. There is something else, Juan said as the men prepared to leave. The Apache woman, the one who warned you. They found her 3 days ago in a shelter about 5 miles from here. She had been caught in the storm trying to warn one more rancher. She did not make it. Thomas felt the words hit him like a physical blow. The woman who had tried so hard to save him, who had prepared the cave with firewood and kindling even after he'd rejected her help, had died trying to help someone else. Did she say anything before she died? She was already gone when they found her, Juan said. But she was found with her hand outstretched, pointing south. They think she was trying to reach someone, to give one more warning. That night, after the men had left and Samuel was asleep, Thomas sat by the stove and held the turquoise stone the Apache woman had given him. In the firelight, the stone seemed to glow with its own inner light, the symbols carved into it creating shadows that danced and shifted. He thought about her sacrifice, about her dedication to helping people even when they didn't want to be helped. He thought about how she'd known he would need the cave, how she'd prepared it for him even though he'd been too stubborn to accept her help directly. She'd saved his life and his son's life, and she'd done it knowing he might never appreciate it, might never even understand what she'd done. Thomas made a decision then. He would rebuild, but he would rebuild differently. He would rebuild with humility instead of pride, with wisdom instead of stubbornness. He would remember the Apache woman's lesson, that the land was stronger than any man's will. That survival sometimes meant letting go of what you thought you needed in order to save what you truly needed. The recovery took years. Thomas worked odd jobs through that spring and summer, breaking horses, hiring himself out as a ranch hand, doing whatever it took to keep the property and feed his son. Slowly, painfully, he built his herd back up, this time with the help of neighbors who remembered that he'd survived, who respected that he'd made the hard choice to save his son even at the cost of everything else. As Samuel grew older, Thomas told him the full story of that winter, not just the facts of what had happened, but the lessons beneath them. He told him about pride and humility, about the difference between strength and stubbornness, about the importance of listening to wisdom, even when it comes from unexpected sources. He told him about the Apache woman who had died trying to save people who probably didn't even know she existed, whose name Thomas had never learned but whose gift had saved their lives. And he made sure Samuel understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong, that the strongest choice is to let go of what you think you want in order to save what you truly need. Thomas kept the turquoise stone for the rest of his life, carrying it in his pocket every day. Sometimes, when he was working the ranch or sitting on the porch watching the sunset over the mountains, he would take it out and hold it, feeling its weight and remembering. Years later, when Samuel was grown and running the ranch himself, a man came through selling goods. Among his wares were some items he said came from the Apache, including a similar turquoise stone with symbols carved into it. Samuel bought it and brought it to his father. "Do you know what these symbols mean?" he asked. Thomas studied the stone, comparing it to the one he'd carried for so long. The symbols were similar. though not identical. I never learned, he admitted. I was too stubborn to ask, and by the time I wanted to know, she was gone. I asked the merchant, Samuel said. He told me they're Apache symbols of protection, but more than that, he said they're a reminder that true strength comes from knowing when to stand firm and when to bend, when to hold on and when to let go. They're a reminder that pride can kill you, but wisdom can save you. Thomas nodded, feeling tears prick at his eyes. She tried to teach me that. It nearly cost me everything before I learned it. But you did learn it, Pa, Samuel said quietly. And you taught it to me. That's worth more than any number of cattle, more than any ranch. That's the real inheritance you're giving me. As Thomas looked at his son, strong, wise, humble in ways Thomas had never been at that age, he understood the final gift the Apache woman had given him. She hadn't just saved their lives that winter night. She'd saved their souls, had given them the chance to become better than they were, to learn from their mistakes instead of being destroyed by them. The ranch prospered under Samuel's management, and he passed it down to his own children with the same lessons his father had taught him. The turquoise stone, the original one the Apache woman had given Thomas, became a family heirloom, passed from generation to generation along with the story of the White Death winter and the woman who had tried to save a stubborn rancher from his own pride. And in the Red Cliffs 2 miles north of the ranch, the cave remained, occasionally used by travelers caught in bad weather. Those who found it were always surprised to discover that it was stocked with firewood and kindling, replaced each autumn by members of the Brennan family, maintaining a tradition started by Thomas himself the year after the Great Storm. It was their way of honoring the Apache woman's memory, of paying forward the gift she'd given them. It was their way of saying that they'd finally learned the lesson she died trying to teach, that in this land survival depends not on individual strength or pride, but on community, on wisdom, on the willingness to help each other and to accept help when it's offered. The ranch still stands today, run by Thomas's great-great-grandchildren. The original turquoise stone sits in a place of honor in the ranch house, and every child born into the family learns the story of the Apache woman who warned of the cold and the rancher who nearly made the wrong choice. They learn about the impossible choice he faced, to hold on to his pride and his possessions, or to let go of everything he'd worked for in order to save what truly mattered. They learn that he made that choice in time, but just barely, and that the margin between wisdom and disaster is often much thinner than we'd like to believe. And they learn, most importantly, that true strength isn't found in stubbornness or pride or the refusal to bend. True strength is found in the wisdom to recognize when you're wrong, the humility to accept help when it's offered, and the courage to let go of what you think you need in order to save what you truly need. The Apache woman had no children of her own, no family that anyone knew of. But in a way, she has descendants, generations of Brennans who carry her wisdom forward, who remember her sacrifice, who strive to live by the lessons she died trying to teach. Her name was never recorded in any history book, never carved on any monument, but she is remembered nonetheless in the stories told around dinner tables, in the cave that's always stocked with firewood, in the turquoise stone that reminds each generation that pride comes before a fall. But wisdom endures forever. Thomas Brennan died at the age of 73, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His last words, spoken to Samuel, who held his hand as his father had once held his in the storm, were simple. I should have listened sooner. Tell them always to listen to the warnings, even when they don't want to hear them, especially when they don't want to hear them. Samuel promised, and he kept that promise. The story of the Apache woman and the White Death winter became more than just family history. It became a parable, a teaching tool, a reminder that the most important lessons often come from the most unexpected sources, and that the cost of ignoring wisdom can be everything you hold dear. The land endures, as it always does. The cattle that died in the White Death winter are long forgotten, their bones absorbed back into the earth. The ranch buildings Thomas built have been replaced and rebuilt multiple times. Even the mountains, eternal as they seem, are slowly wearing away under the relentless pressure of wind and water and time. But the lesson remains, passed down through generations, growing stronger rather than weaker with each telling. And somewhere in those mountains, in the country where the Apache woman lived and died, there are those who still remember the old ways, who still read the signs in the earth and sky, who still understand that the land speaks to those who will listen. And sometimes on cold winter nights when the wind howls down from the north, people swear they can hear her voice in the storm, still trying to warn, still trying to save, still offering the wisdom that some will hear and some will not. but that all desperately need. The choice, as it always was, remains ours to make.